We're streaming live. We're ready to go. Is there a last minute question?
Ruby, you were saying something?
It's all good.
Okay. Hello, welcome everyone. We are streaming live right at our 1 o'clock hour, so we can go ahead and begin the program. Welcome to today's event.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arlene Farley, and I serve as the Interim Dean of Academic Affairs, Research and Assessment here at Bunker Hill Community College. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's event. I bring you warm greetings on behalf of our president, Pam Ettinger, who is not able to join us today, but was extremely excited to hear that Dr. Wood would be joining our college community and sharing in his fantastic research and knowledge and experience, and really wants for us to have a deeply engaging session this afternoon. For those of you who are new to Bunker Hill and to our college and our work, we are grateful and excited to share this space with you this afternoon as we learn and really grow and deepen our work with our students, all of them, but especially our Black and Brown students, our Black and Latinx students, our students of color who really have a very different experience navigating higher ed and reaching their educational, career, and transfer goals. It's really important too because the COVID-19 pandemic has really brought to the forefront, right? Not just for us in higher ed, but really across the country, the vast number of inequities that exists in and across all of our systems. And it's not just within educational systems, right? For example, we at Bunker Hill have always known that our students who come from many different areas of Greater Boston and its neighborhoods encounter multiple social and institutional inequities on a daily basis. And we strive to create an institution that is grounded in equity mindedness, that is striving continuously to improve our understanding of equity and equity mindedness so that we can support our students really in meeting their goals so that we can reduce the gaps in outcomes for our students so that our students are able to thrive and reach the fullness of the potential that they have. We understand and we identify and we acknowledge that there are a number of inequities that exist within and across multiple systems within our institution that make for learning environments that are not always welcoming, not always safe, but that need to be addressed and improved and bettered because we owe it to our students and our students deserve that of us. We're grateful for programs like HOPE, the sponsors of today's event. And for those of you not familiar with HOPE, it stands for Halting Oppressive Pathways Through Education. And the work that HOPE has been doing on our campus has been transformative, not only through their administration, but also through the engagement of peers, of students who work as ambassadors and peer mentors to Black and Latinx men who are here to pursue their goals and reach those goals through education. And wherever it may take them, we want to be here as an institution for them to support them. HOPE has been using Dr. Woods' groundbreaking educational series, Black Minds Matter, to lead our campus in really transformative and important dialogues around the perceptions and practices and barriers that exist for Black and Latinx men in this pursuit of educational goals. So we are thrilled to have Dr. Wood here. We are thrilled to hear from a researcher, from a practitioner, from someone who is walking the talk and asking the hard questions, and sharing in his insight and his information and his knowledge. We're forever grateful. We're happy to have you here, Dr. Wood. Welcome to Bunker Hill. And I'd like to now pass this on to Nuri Chandler-Smith to tell us more about hope, and to continue on our welcome and beginning today's event. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a fantastic afternoon.
Thank you so much, Arlene. My name is Nuri Chandler-Smith. I'm the Dean of Academic Support and College Pathway Programs at Bunker Hill, and I serve as one of the co-leads of the HOPE Initiative. Arlene, you did a fantastic job in explaining HOPE, but just to reiterate for those who are not familiar with our work, the HOPE Initiative is designed to examine and eliminate the social, institutional, and academic barriers that often prevent males of color from achieving their full potential at Bunker Hill and beyond. And we really employ a twofold strategy in doing this. The support is not the word that we choose to use in the HOPE Initiative, because that would indicate that there is something wrong with our students, and there is not. Instead, we understand that there are these systemic barriers that have been put in place. And so we work with our students to navigate those barriers right now while doing the long-term hard work ourselves to do professional development, to transform ourselves as individuals and as an institution so that our students don't have to navigate barriers anymore. So that professional development is really at the core of today's event. And so I want to pass it along to my colleague, Carlos, to tell you a little bit more, really briefly, about the professional development that we have been doing. And then we're going to pass it along to Dr. Wood, because that's why we're really all here.
Thank you, Nuri. I just want to say good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, Arlene, for that great introduction. My name is Carlos Maynard. I'm a faculty in the Behavioral Sciences Department. I'm one of the co-laborers with the HOPE Initiative and the HOPE Fellows Program. The HOPE Fellows Professional Development was developed to allow both faculty and staff to engage in the Black Minds Matter series and our Yale Open course, which focuses on African American history, to provide context. And this allows them to reflect on content, whether it be insights, recommendations, suggestions, evidence, data, and best practices that can aid their work and the success of our HOPE scholars, Black and Brown male students. Success for us are aligned to our core outcomes at Bunker Hill, such as retention, persistence, and completion in many different ways, among other important outcomes as well. Our event today featuring Dr. Wood is part of this continuous professional development for our communities within and beyond Bunker Hill Community College. We want to thank you for joining us in this platform, and we look forward to engaging with each of you this afternoon. At this time, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Evans Ereles.
Thank you, Carlos. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Evans Ereles. I'm the interim director of the HOPE Initiative, and I am also one of the co-leads of the initiative. I have the esteemed honor of introducing Dr. Wood to all of you. Dr. J. Luke Wood is the Vice President of Student Affairs and Campus Diversity and Dean's Distinguished Professor of Education at San Diego State University. Wood also serves as the co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, a national research and practice center that partners with community colleges to support their capacity and advancing outcomes for underserved students of color. Dr. Wood's research focuses on factors affecting the success of boys and men of color in education, with a specific focus on early childhood education and community colleges. In particular, his research examines contributors, social, psychological, academic, environmental, and institutional, to positive outcomes. Dr. Wood has delivered over 1,000 scholarly, professional, and conference presentations. His research has been featured by NBC, the New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Huffington Post, Fortune Magazine, the LA Times, the Miami Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, C-SPAN, and the National Press Club. Dr. Wood has authored over 160 publications including more than 70 peer-reviewed journal articles and 15 books. Needless to say, his credentials more than speak for himself. We are all very excited to be here with him today. And with that, and without any further ado, it is my honor to pass it over to Dr. Wood. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I truly appreciate it, and all the kind words that were said. It is my pleasure to be here today and to be able to talk with you about the work that we've been doing and some implications that it may have for the work that you're doing. One of the things that was really exciting is that this is an institution that's committed itself to equity, and not just as a recent invention, but something that has been an ongoing commitment. And so I'm proud to be part of an event that's moving the ball forward rather than starting it. And so excited to be here for that. I'm going to go ahead and share screen and jump in, and just know that, you know, I'll give some remarks first, and then we're going to have ample time to be able to go through that Q&A and be able to have time to really respond to questions that folks may have. And so just want to make sure that you can see the screen. I've seen heads nodding, so I think we're good to go. And the title of this presentation is Advancing Equity in a Climate of Resistance, Aligning Culture with Strategy. And what we're really thinking about is, how can we advance outcomes for our students who have been historically underrepresented and underserved in education? And in the work that I do, a lot of that focuses on men of color, particularly Black, Latinx, and Native American men, and trying to understand what campuses can better do to support them and their success, recognizing that most of our institutions were not ever designed to serve this population. And so there are structural challenges that are in place that oftentimes impede our ability to be as successful as we would like to be. And so we're going to talk about that. What does that look like? What are those climate and systemic things that take place within our institutions that we know that we can change? So I want to just give a quick overview of the center that I'm coming from. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm from the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, which is a research and practice center housed at San Diego State University. And we work with community colleges primarily, but we do some work with schools and universities across the country to really understand what does it take to improve success and outcomes for our students who have been, again, historically underrepresented and served. We do that through assessment, we do that through empirical research, we do that through professional learning. And ultimately, just like you, we're informed by the work that's been done on equity. And when we think about equity, really what we're thinking about is groups that are experiencing disproportionate impact, and recognizing that we have to do something different and intercede and provide resources in order to remediate disparities in their outcomes and their experiences. And I'm going to come back to that because there's some nuances in there that I want to make sure that we're thinking about. But the work that we do is really informed by the work of Dr. Estela Bensimon, who recently retired from the Center for Urban Education at USC, but has made a lasting impact, I believe, on our field. And she has talked about this notion of, okay, so we have this notion of equity, right? This heightened focus on groups experience disproportionate impact. But what does it mean for that notion to change the way that I think about the work that I do? So to be equity minded, not just to talk about equity, but to have it influence the ways that I think about the problems and the solutions that are needed to improve outcomes. And she says it really comes down to four primary things. First is that we recognize that there are systemic inequities across our different social systems, whether that's in education, employment, healthcare, the criminal injustice system. And I purposely say injustice because oftentimes for people who look like me, there's no justice in it. And recognizing that those systems work together to create a unique experience for our Black, Indigenous, and Latinx and people of color. And so when we think about that, one of the things that I think is really important to recognize that a inequity in one system can serve to amplify an inequity in another system. So for example, if you have an inequity in employment, you are either unemployed or underemployed, that can have a direct translation to your access and quality of healthcare, right? So inequity in employment can lead to inequities and exacerbate inequities in healthcare. Probably what we're more familiar with is the linkage that we talk about where we think about what is called the school to prison pipeline, which suggests that inequities in education serve to amplify inequities in our criminal injustice system. And so recognizing that is really important part of being an equity-minded educator. And the second and third parts is really that we move away from these notions where we blame students, we blame their families, we blame their communities, to really, instead of looking out the window into what we see as being the issues, is to look in the mirror and recognize that we're contributing significantly, oftentimes more so to anything else, to the problem. And that problem really is rooted in racism, and we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about it in pretty direct ways as we get further into this. And then the fourth part is that if we're going to be equity minded, we have to critically reflect upon our own roles. We have to be able to think about the work that we've done and recognize that if we're talking about systems and systems that how these systems break down in terms of serving our students, if we work for an institution, we are part of that system. So we don't get to shift off that burden. We have to take on that responsibility. It's not comfortable, but it's that kind of thinking that's going to lead to better changes and outcomes for our students. Now, I know I'm presenting today, but if my colleague Frank was here, he would actually add that there's another element of being equity-minded, and that is to hold one another accountable. Because too often we all know the individuals who are denigrating our students, who aren't supporting them in the ways that they should be, that aren't living up to the values that we espouse around diversity and equity and inclusion, but we don't do anything about it. And we don't do anything about it oftentimes because we don't know how to respond, or we're scared, or we are worried about it somehow impacting us. But we do so when we avoid engaging, we do so from a standpoint of privilege that our students rarely have. And so it's incumbent upon us to engage and to address these issues, even when it's uncomfortable, or maybe especially when it's uncomfortable. So the other thing that I would say is that equity, as I mentioned before, refers to a heightened focus on groups that experience disproportionate impact in order to remediate disparities in their experiences and in their outcomes. Now, in their experiences and their outcomes, notice that it doesn't say that we're remediating disparities in students, their families, or their communities. We're remediating disparities in their experiences that they have within our institution. So it's on us as educators. And there's lots of groups that experience disproportionate impact. It can include our students of color. A lot of the work that we've done has focused specifically on Black students through the work of Black Minds Matter and understanding that there is unique experience in being Black in this country that is shaped by experiences with anti-Blackness, that anti-Black racism is a unique type of racism that has a unique, creates a unique experience for Black students. We also know that beyond looking at race, that there are intersections with other forms of marginality. And I think about that from the perspective of critical race theory, that our racial identities intersect with these other identities that you can see here. So we know that, for example, students of color are oftentimes going to have outcomes that look different than that of their peers, but those differences can be even further amplified if they're current or former foster youth, such as myself, or if they've experienced food insecurities, housing insecurities, transportation concerns, employment barriers, if they're students with disabilities, if they've been justice involved in some way. And so we want to recognize that there are lots of ways in which those inequities can be further amplified. Now, the challenge is that a lot of institutions want to say that they have created change. But the truth is, what I see more often is that they have made wide sweeping changes from a rising tide lifts all boats strategy that has oftentimes not translated into actual success. There was a campus that I was presenting to, this was right before COVID hit. And they were heralding the fact that they had increased student success by a certain percentage. And I thought, hey, that's great. I'm glad the campus was able to do that. They'd had a 5-year action plan around equity. And ultimately what it showed is that if you looked at students, that the increases in persistence, increases in core success, all across multiple indicators. When I got to the campus, one of the things that I presented to them was looking at their data and recognizing that, yes, while their outcomes had increased overall, that when they looked and disaggregated that by race, it turns out that the outcomes went up for students who identified as white. But if you looked at students who were Black and Latinx at that institution, the outcomes had actually declined. But because they were a smaller part of that population, what happened was it didn't get captured in that larger percentage. And so the campus was saying, look at our success, we did it. When in reality, they actually, as part of their equity efforts, further exacerbated issues that they were facing. And there's lots of other things that we see derail equity efforts on many campuses. It can be a culture that's based in compliance, where we are doing equity efforts because it's something that we're asked to do by accreditation, by our system, by the office of the president or the chancellor, right? They asked us to do these things, and so we're doing it as a mode of compliance, but it hasn't actually led to a difference in the ways that we think about the work that we do and our commitments to students. It can be a culture of complacency where people say, why do we have to do that? Why do we have to do this? Nothing's going to change. The problem is bigger than me. My colleague and friend, Sean Harper, refers to that last statement as a public declaration of incompetence. When we say like, hey, I grew up in this community and I really don't know how to teach Black students. I don't know how to teach Latinx students. I don't know what you want me to do. I'm an educator, not a social worker, right? And ultimately, we would never allow students in our classroom to have learned information and then to say that they don't know. And so we have to bring that same level of accountability that we ask students to have to ourselves and the work that we do. Probably the most pervasive issue that we see are deficit perspectives. And we're going to talk about that a bit more as we get further into this. But ultimately, when people blame students, blame their families, and blame their communities, and it happens in different types of ways. There's the direct deficit where it's, the student doesn't care, they're lazy, they're not really here for school. Those perspectives are pervasive. But there's also ones that try to tie it to larger systemic issues to then again throw our hands up and say that we can't do anything about it. And what that looks like is when people might say, well, they come from a family that doesn't really care about school, or they came from a school that wasn't really successful in preparing them, so it's not their fault. We can't do anything about it, but it's not their fault. Those are still deficit perspectives because we're seeing students as having the inability to be able to be successful. Our job is not to save, our job is to empower. We cannot bring a deficit perspective to equity work. Data and transparency is also an issue. And that was a perfect example, the one I gave earlier, where the campus had said, our outcomes are going up, but that's because they hadn't looked deep enough into their data to disaggregate it in meaningful ways. It can be a culture of instability. And in fact, a good example of this was a book that was written by, an edited book by Michael Suje, looking at Black men in college. And what it did is the first half of the book was research talking about, sense of belonging, predictor models for persistence and success. And then the second half of the book was talking about what are the programs that need to be in place that can actually support students in their success. If you were to go to that same book today and look at the second half of it, half of those programs, if not more, are not in existence anymore. And they were heralded as being programs that were effective. And one of the reasons why that occurs is that if we build a program around a person and not around an institutional commitment, when that person leaves, so does our equity effort. If we build our equity efforts around one-time funds, when those one-time funds evaporate, so does our equity effort, right? So we have to have a stability to the work that we're doing. And I'm going to provide some recommendations on what that looks like as we get further here. But I also want to recognize that misappropriation and intentionality can also be a major thing. In California, this may be 7 years ago now, there was a huge, large-scale effort across the whole state to do equity plans. The state said, we want every campus to do an equity plan focused on students who experience disproportionate impact, i.e. Black, Latinx, Native American, Southeast Asian, and Pacific Islander students. And what we want you to do is create a plan that's going to change that. And then we're going to give you substantial monies to be able to address that issue. So when you go back and you look at the plans that were put into place, a lot of the campuses had needs that weren't being met financially, right? There were base needs around STEM labs in particular, or resources in certain areas. And then what people did is like, well, we have a need that's already over here. It'll benefit everyone. So why don't we just put the money in that place? And a lot of the campuses put their efforts and their monies into STEM, but didn't recognize and look at the fact that a lot of their students of color weren't in STEM, weren't experiencing STEM in healthy ways because the environment was hostile, and were leaving STEM. So they were investing in an area in terms of a lab, but they weren't investing in the culture to change the STEM climate to be better for those students. So it was a misappropriation of what those resources were really for and really about. It can also be a poor conceptualization. I oftentimes find that this quote that you see here is one that people say too often. Let's be honest, equity really means lowering our standards and our rigor. Equity does not mean lowering standards and rigor. Equity means that we're providing intentional efforts, resources, and interventions to ensure that everyone has the ability to succeed at those high standards and rigor, recognizing that most of the breakdowns aren't in our students, but really within our own institutions and ourselves. Marginalization. All of our equity work takes place in this one area. We have programs that are designed to support students. We have areas that are designed to support our students of color. And we assume that, hey, they're responsible for it. But no one program, no one person, no one department can be responsible for increasing outcomes. It takes all of us. And there's lots of other things that you can see here. I could go through all of them, but what I really want to get to, which is the focus of this, is the racially toxic environments that oftentimes take place within our institutions that can make it even more difficult for these efforts to move forward. And that's when we get to our taxonomy of educators' perspectives. And I know that for some of you who participated in Black Minds Matter or participated in some of our other webinars, you've seen this before. And so I wanted to make sure that everyone who hasn't had a chance to see it has an understanding of what we think are some of the big problems. Now, where this came from is I have the privilege of doing lots of training focused on implicit bias and microaggressions at campuses. It's kind of an area of specialty, recognizing that it has a direct impact on the success of our students of color, but also on our faculty and staff of color as well. And I walked into a presentation, and it's happened multiple times, but one stands out in particular right now, where I walked into a presentation, there was a room of 30 people, and it was a brown bag session. People were told, bring your lunches, come and hear this important conversation on microaggressions. So get to the room, and I see the person who's putting on the event has this look of dismay on their face. They looked upset, they looked dejected, I couldn't know what it was. And I said, what's going on? Yeah, because I could tell that there was something wrong. And I remember her saying to me, you know, when we asked you to come here and talk about microaggressions, it was because of Jerry in chemistry and Susan in financial aid. Because we all know that Jerry and Susan are microaggressing the heck out of their students. And I'm thinking to myself, well, yeah, Jerry and Susan aren't here, but I'm not surprised because Jerry and Susan aren't going to come to a voluntary session on microaggressions because Jerry and Susan don't care. And part of that is just the real understanding that not everyone at our institutions will care about our students of color and our Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students in the same ways that we will. And I'm going to go even further to say that when you start adding in intersections with other forms of marginality, the experience of Black misandry, a pathological aversion towards Black men, that those experiences can be intensified. And you can say the same thing in terms of the unique experience for Black women and Black non-binary students and others. So adding in these intersections makes it even more compelling in terms of what's taking place. But when we left that, what I recognized is that there are different people with different motivations. Not everyone is going to care in the same way or have the same level of understanding about what needs to take place. So on your screen, you see a taxonomy of what we think are some of the bigger groups that we're trying to reach when we're doing this work. And on the top right-hand side of your screen is a box that says K and W. And there's essentially two characteristics here, right? People who know what to do, right? The knowledge. And then two, the people who are willing to do it, the action. So knowledge and action. And they don't always go hand in hand, right? You can know how to do something and not do it, right? You can know how to eat well and not always eat well. You can know how to work out and not always work out. You can know how to do a lot of things and not necessarily put them into practice. So we want to basically say, how do we marry those two things? So if you look in the top right-hand side of your screen, these are the people who first know what to do and they're willing to do it. That's the first group that we've identified. And this is the best group, right? These are the people who are committed to the work. And it's what we refer to as the choir. The choir, they know the strategies and practices that are necessary, right? They know how to engage in culturally relevant teaching and multicultural counseling, how to build relationships with students. They know how to do it. And even more importantly, they're willing to do it. They're having the action, they're putting it into practice. I was talking with a colleague, she has a podcast, this was about a month ago. And one of the things that came up that she had said to me is like, well, you know, you can be in the choir and not always be singing or not be singing as loud as you should. So just because you're in the choir doesn't mean that you don't still have growth to do. Doesn't mean you still don't have to look in the mirror every single morning and hold yourself accountable to be even better at the work you're doing. So, but I would say this, that if you're part of the choir, I'm glad you're here and I hope you continue to sing, and I would encourage you to sing even louder. The second group are those who are our allies. These are the people who they don't necessarily know what to do. They don't know what those strategies and practices look like to support Latinx students, right? They don't know what those strategies look like to support our students who've been minoritized, but they're willing to do it. So the bridge between the allies and the choir is training, it's development, it's opportunities to learn how to better sharpen our tools so that we can be even more effective with our students. And now let me say this before I go on to the bottom two rows. You can be part of the choir when it comes to some groups and be part of the allies when it comes to others. And if you look at this taxonomy and you think to yourself that across all different minoritized groups, the ones I was mentioning earlier, right, that I'm part of the choir for every single one of those groups, then you're probably part of the problem because all of us have work to do. So you might be, let's say, part of the choir when it comes to Black students, when it comes to Latinx students, when it comes to our LGBTIAQ+ students, but maybe you're really more of an ally when it comes to our undocumented students, or you're more of an ally when it comes to our students who experience food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation concerns, and employment barriers. And I know that all those groups aren't totally distinct, but what I'm saying is we have to always see where do we fit when it comes to each different group. Now, on the bottom hand side of your screen are a group of individuals who are unwilling to employ the practices that are necessary. They're not willing to do the work that's necessary, and it's also important for us to understand who they are too. And the first group that you see there are the resistors. These are the individuals who are characterized by they don't know what to do, so they don't have the knowledge and they're unwilling to do it. And we break them up into two different groups, active resistors and passive resistors. Now, active resistors actively resist. And when we're talking about creating a toxic climate, that's what we're referring to oftentimes is those active resistors. These are the individuals who will send out an email across campus, CCing everyone saying that this effort that's focused on equity, or this presentation that's focused on microaggression, or this conversation that needs to take place on critical race theory, that all of those things are bad and you shouldn't participate. These are the individuals who will be in a meeting and they will stand up when there's a conversation on how to support Black male students, and they'll push back saying, well, why aren't we talking about all these other students or students who represent a larger demographic on their campus? So the active resistors are known to us. Most people, though, who are resistors aren't active. And the reason that they're not active is they want to be seen as good and as nice. And they'll be good and nice all the way to the destruction of our students. And Tyrone Howard, one of my colleagues, sometimes refers to them as sympathetic destroyers of dreams. And so the passive resistors are those who want to stay out of the fray. They hear there's going to be a conversation on racial equity. They hear there's going to be a conversation on implicit bias or explicit bias. And what they do is they vote with their lack of presence. They're simply not going to go. They're not going to show up. They're not going to be part of it. They're going to vote with their lack of presence. They'll say, hey, I'll see you at that meeting, but they're not going to be there. Or they just aren't going to even say that at all because they have another conflict. And so ultimately, you have to have the commitment in order to be able to get the work done. The last group is the defiant. These are the individuals who really do know what to do, but they choose not to. And people can become defiant in a lot of different ways. One pathway that we see are those who have been part of the choir and have been burnt out, and they become burnt out, and then they become recalcitrant, and then ultimately they can become part of the problem. But more often what we see are that they are passive and active resistors who've been forced to go to mandatory training. So they know the strategies, they know the practices, but they're not going to put them into practice unless it's with their comfort students. They're students who look like them, who come from similar communities as them, the students who they are going to personally invest in. Now, I was presenting this with my colleague Frank at a conference, and we had a colleague there from the College Futures Foundation. And after watching this of these different categories, he came up to us afterwards and said, you know, this is a good model, and I think you're onto something here, but I also think that you're missing a really important group. And, you know, we've put a lot of time and effort into developing this. You know, we've had students who've done research using this as a framework. And so when someone says that, you think to yourself, okay, well, what are we missing? And as soon as he explained what we were missing, I thought to myself, he's absolutely right. And so what was said to us is, what about the people who fall in the middle? The people who think they know what to do, but really don't. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who are like that. And what we do is now we have a fifth category, and we refer to them as the oblivious, the people who think they know what to do and really don't. And there's different types of oblivious. We see them falling into really kind of three general categories. The first are those who are bringing to the environment they work in a savior complex. They think that their job is to save, not to empower. They think their job is to know the solution rather than asking the students themselves what they need. They bring a deficit mindset to equity work, and as a result, they can be an incredibly bad ambassador for what it means to be committed to student success. And the challenge is that they oftentimes fancy themselves as allies or choir when really they're not. The second group is those who are non-reflective. The people who know what to say. They can say the right words. They know to say equity as opposed to equality. Why? Because it's more gender inclusive. They know to say Latinx as opposed to Latino because it's more gender inclusive, right? They know the language. I said equity as opposed to equality, gender inclusive. I meant equity as opposed to equality because of the right motivations, right? So those are two examples, right? So they can use the language, but ultimately you have to look at this. Not just what they say, but what they do. And oftentimes I find in my work that these can be some of the most devastating people because they say the right things, but they don't do the right actions. And as a result, they serve as, again, bad ambassadors for equity. And then the final group are those who we refer to as grandstanders. And so where this grandstanders comes from are those who are there for the public image. If you go back 20 years ago, it was not cool to be the equity person. You were viewed as a disruptor. You were viewed as someone who was creating potentially a bad climate on campus. You were viewed as a troublemaker, not an angelic troublemaker, and a troublemaker. And so yeah, we want to recognize that things have changed. And so now you can make a career on being an equity person. And because that has occurred, it has opened the door for people to come in who don't have the right motivations. And so ultimately, if it's about you, if it's about your career, if it's about your public image and your success, then it's not about the students. And the motivation for this work is just as important as what you do because it influences the authenticity that you bring. And students are really good at being able to judge between those who are authentic about their care for them and those who are disingenuous or performative. Now, when we think about these different groups, we have to recognize that there's different ways to reach them, right? You got the choir, the allies, the resistors, the defiant. And ultimately, what we recognize is that we have to reach them through what we call the 4 E's: to empower, to educate, to enlighten, and to encourage. So with the choir, we want to empower them with additional strategies and practices that make them even more effective in doing the work they do. Recognizing that equity is not a end destination, but a lifelong journey of growing and developing. I learn new things every day. I'm growing every day. I'm going back to language I've used and changing it. I'm revising things. And even then, will never be caught up, because that's how things change, because we're learning more and more every day about the marginalization of our students and how we can be more effective as educators. The second is with our allies. Our job is to educate them, to provide them with the training and development they need so that they can become part of that choir. And recognizing that we can't shy away from the difficult topics, and we have to really engage in conversations that really are uncomfortable. But it's in that uncomfortability that we can really start to change ourselves and improve. Then there's those who are the oblivious. Again, the people who think they know what to do and really don't. And with them, our job is to enlighten. And the challenge is, again, because they see themselves as part of the choir, or part of the allies, we have to have that conversation with them in ways that demonstrate to them that the personal humility that it takes in order to be able to do this work effectively. So we have to enlighten them so that they can hopefully become part of that choir. Now, with the resistors, remember I said there was 2 different types, the active and passive, and we think there's different ways in which you reach them. With our passive resistors, and this represents the large effort that most campuses are engaged with, is around passive resistors, our job is to encourage them. But specifically, we want to encourage them to care. Because if we can get them to care, then we can get them to employ the strategies and practices that are necessary for their success. But getting them to care is a very strategic effort. So first of all, going back to how this whole framework began, they're not going to come to a voluntary brown bag training at noon on microaggressions, right? So what do you have to do? You have to go to the places and spaces that they're already at. Department meetings, convocation, all faculty days, all staff days, flex days. We have to be intrusive with them, just like we're intrusive with our students, in order to be able to bring them along. But we also have to recognize that their motivation is different than everyone else. The choir and the allies, they're committed to this work from more of a social justice, educational equity perspective. But the passive resistors, they care about things that they can see and they can feel: compliance, organizational funding, retention, tenure promotion, recognition, release time. They care about tangible things. And ultimately, what we want to do is create an environment where we incentivize them temporarily as they make that transition so that they can become part of training and development efforts that encourage them to care. And then lastly, with the other 2 groups, our active resistors and our defiant, we believe we have to redirect their efforts. Find something that they can do, empower them to do it that doesn't touch our minoritized students, so that we're removing the damage that they will experience, our students. And then ultimately, we want them to be able to wake up one day at an institution that's different, that they may not recognize. And then they have a tough choice. They can either get on board with the equity efforts and support our students, or they can make the decision to transition on. And our goal is that they would come on board and become part of the solution. And I'll say this, one of the most probably affirming things I've ever had happen was a college that we had been working at for about 3 years. And there was a faculty member in particular who you could tell by body language was not on the equity team. And this individual, after about 3 years of work, came up to us at the end of a session that we had done. It was another professional learning session, and said, you know, when you all first came here, I have to admit that I was an active resistor. And I can't say that I'm part of the choir yet, but I'm trying to be an ally. And ultimately, that's what we hope for, is that we can get them to the point where they are trying, that they're going to put themselves in that realm of uncomfortability so that they can make an environment that's more comfortable for our students. Now, when I think about this, part of what influences the way that I conceptualize some of this work is through the work of Ibram Kendi and in his work in terms of what it means to be an anti-racist. And what he talks about is that in order for us to think about race and racism and racial inequities, that racial inequities themselves are created by two things. First, by policies that are in place. And we think about that in lots of different ways. It can be a departmental policy, it can be an institutional policy, it can be a district policy, it can be a state policy, it can be a national policy, but there are policies themselves that are racist at every single level of our institutions. And that ultimately, it's not just the policy, but the ideas that marry with those policies that inform the ways that we do the work. And ultimately, examples of that can be the racial inequities can be the attainment gap, the wealth gap, the justice gap, the educational equity gaps. It can be racist policies such as school segregation, redlining, mass incarceration. I would say that some campuses have add drop policies, financial aid policies, attendance policies that can also be informed by racist ideologies and practices. And some of those ideologies say that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are academically inferior, that they're financially irresponsible, that they're prone to criminality. These are racialized tropes that many of us have been familiar with, experienced, and heard about for years, but ultimately it's the marrying of those two things together that serve to create the inequities that our students are experiencing. And those racist ideas don't just stay with us, right? Yes, it influences policy, it influences practice, but it also influences the interpersonal relationships and dynamics that our students experience with educators. There's lots of different ways in which people talk about it. And one of the ways is through the lens of what's called racial microaggressions. And microaggressions, I know that many of you are already familiar with microaggressions. It was a concept created by a scholar from Harvard University, Chester Pierce, who was looking at the experiences of Black people in our society and trying to understand the mundane experiences with racism that happen on a daily basis. And since then, the work has been expanded by a number of scholars, Daryl Wing Su, Daniel Solorzano, and many others. And essentially, it's the subtle racism that sits beneath the surface. It can be unintentional, though it can be intentional, but it communicates the negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. I'm not going to read the definition on your screen, but it's in the top right-hand side of your screen. And ultimately, it's the subtle racism that happens on a daily basis. Now, where I'm from far northern California. I was born in Oakland. My biological mother was incarcerated at the time. I became a ward of the court, went to the foster care system, and moved to with a family that later adopted me to far northern California. And I went to a town of 1,600 people where me and my twin brother were the only Black students in our school. And on a daily basis, every single day, I was called multiple times, either the N-word or niglet or cottonhead or other racial epithets as part of my daily experience, probably up until the time I was in 5th or 6th grade. And so for me, racism wasn't subtle. It wasn't beneath the surface. It was direct. Like if somebody calls you the N-word and you're a young kid, you're like, okay, well, I'm not inviting them to the birthday party because you know where they stand. For me, that was much easier to understand than when I went off to college to Sacramento. And when I got to Sacramento, it wasn't the in-your-face racism, it was the beneath the surface. It was someone who would say to me, oh, wow, you're so articulate, with a sense of surprise. And I would at first, not knowing what that meant, I at first thought, is that a compliment? But in reality, recognizing that it wasn't a compliment because it came from a sense of surprise. And what they were really saying to me is that I didn't expect that you would be. It was when I would walk on campus at nighttime and people would ask me for my ID. And I was thinking, oh, they're asking me for my ID like they ask everyone else. But then I would see everyone else walking by me, but they're not asking anybody else for their ID. And I would think to myself, well, why is that happening? It's because it was beneath the surface. And because of that, with microaggressions, we have to recognize that it's not what's said, it's what's really said. Now, I love being in person because I'm a call and response kind of presenter. So you have to just do me a little bit of justice here and repeat after me, because it's not what's said, it's what's really said. Because it's not what's said, it's what's
Really sad.
right. And what's really said is that you're different from us. You don't belong here. You're not intelligent, or capable. People of color are lazy, they don't care. You're criminal, you're dangerous. So when someone says with a sense of surprise, wow, you're so articulate, or can I see your ID at nighttime on campus? What's really said are very different messages. And that's what impacts our students. And the challenge is that sometimes we can be so oblivious to what we say to our students that we think we're complimenting them and we're dissing them at the same time. And that's why I have a colleague that refers to microaggressions as complidisses, right? Because sometimes we think that's what we're doing, but the message that they receive is very different. There's lots of different types of microaggressions, and this isn't a presentation on microaggressions, so I'm just going to basically say that in our work, we find that the ones in the top left-hand corner, ascription of intelligence, assumption of criminality, second-class citizenship, and pathologizing culture, are the ones that are most recurrent in our students' lives and experiences. And just, quickly put, an ascription of intelligence is when we assume that a person of color is either more or less intelligent based upon their race. And when we're talking about Black and Latinx and Native American students, particularly those who are identified as men, we oftentimes find that the perception is that they are less intelligent, that they are less capable, that they are inferior. And we've seen lots of examples of this. Some of these examples came during COVID, where a faculty member called a student. The professor called me about a week after I submitted a paper, and she said, wow, you wrote this? She was shocked that I could write, right? It was a sense of surprise that was rooted in a racist ideology that was communicated to a student in what they perceived to be a compliment. Or if you go to the one that's the third one down, in a Google Hangout group of students, when students said, when I give out ideas, they ignored me like I don't exist, like my ideas are bad. But I'm the only person of color in the group. And think about the message that that sends. It can be an assumption of criminality, where we assume that we are dangerous, deviant, up to no good. And this is even more intensified for those who identify as male and those who are darker skinned. That the perception about being aggressive and physical and defiant. But I would also say that that they can also differ, because I experienced, for example, my colleague Frank, we talk about this a lot. He's a darker skinned Black male, I'm a lighter skinned Black male. We both experience assumption of criminality, but it plays out in different ways. People are more likely to refer to him as aggressive, as dangerous, as someone that they're fearful of. And with me, it's more so that I'm sly, that I'm manipulative, that I'm going to cut corners in some sort of way. So it's still that same kind of assumption of criminality, but it can play out a little differently. But ultimately, we see that it influences all of our students. The example on the top, I wrote the professor to let him know that I wasn't able to attend class because my internet was down. And he wrote back very condescendingly, insinuating that I was lying. And the student exclaimed, lots of people are having internet problems right now. Why is he singling me out? And then the last one, I'm going to skip past these, I can give those examples later, is pathologizing culture. That's when we assume that the values and the communication styles of people of color are less than ideal. I think about it most clearly as the statements that I hear too often, that they're lazy, they don't care, they're not really here for school, or they're only here for the financial aid, they'll be gone by census. Those are real things that faculty members say to us all the time in the interviews that we do. And it indicates this notion that we view certain communities as being lesser than. Now, why all that matters is because it influences our students in two ways. I'm going to say these last two things, and then we're going to transition to the Q&A. I have lots of recommendations on what we can do about that, but I want that to be part of this. But one of the ways in which we see all this influence our students is through what is called race lighting. Now, many of you may be familiar with what is gaslighting, and race lighting is essentially gaslighting, but in a racialized context. We wrote about it first in this article that came out in Diverse Issues in Higher Education. We've since had pieces on it in Psychology Today, a few more in Diverse, and also a brief that we've done. But essentially, the term gaslight itself comes from the play Gaslight, which was written by Patrick Hamilton in the 1930s. And essentially, it's a story about a couple. They happen to be white, and it's a male and female. They're married, and they move into this affluent neighborhood, right? And Jack is the husband, Bella is the wife, and Jack is the villain. And Jack is intent upon making Bella feel as if she is losing her mind. And so he does things purposely to make her feel that way. They're in their house and there's pictures on their wall. And he takes the pictures down, he hides them, and then he accuses her of stealing them. He takes knives and forks and spoons and pensions from their kitchen and he hides them, and from their dresser, and he hides them, and he accuses her of stealing them. And then when she defends herself, he says, well, you know how you imagine things. He goes into a different part of the house that she's totally unaware of, and he's banging around looking for jewels. And she hears this noise banging around, and she brings that to his attention, and he says, well, you know how you imagine things. But the term gaslight itself comes from the fact that when he went into that separate part of the house, he would light a light. And that light would be lit in that one part of the house, the new part of the house, with an existing light in another part of the house, and they're both lit by gas. And there's only so much gas that's going around the house, and so the gas would become more diffuse, and both the lights would dim and flicker. And so she would see the light dim, she would see the light flicker, and she would bring it to his attention, and he would gaslight her by saying, you know how you imagine things. And unfortunately, when we're talking about our Black, Indigenous people of color, ultimately what happens is this, is that they experience race lighting, where because of the pervasiveness of the assumption of criminality, the pathologizing of their culture, their ascription of intelligence, they're made to feel as if they are losing their minds. It leads them to second guess their experiences, their feelings, their capabilities, their knowledge, their decision-making, their recollections, and even their basic humanity. So many of you may experience this if you're people of color as professionals, and our students can experience this as students. But if you ever get to the point where you say to yourself, maybe I'm not as smart as I thought it was. Maybe I'm not as good as I thought it was. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe it's me. That doubt, that disorientation, that's race lighting. And ultimately, concluding, it leads to another concept that was created by my colleague and friend, Dr. William Smith from the University of Utah, to racial battle fatigue. And what he has done is he's created a powerful framework for making sense of the cognitive, emotional, and physiological, the physical impact of racism, whether you're in an environment that's explicitly racist, like the one I grew up in, or whether you're in one that's beneath the surface. What happens is that those messages and those experiences, they accumulate and they affect you in ways that are akin to combat stress syndrome. The physiological symptoms can be a tension headache, a backache, an elevated heartbeat, an upset stomach. And in the work that I do in early childhood education, looking particularly at preschool, kindergarten, and first grade, we see this all the time. You have a young Black boy who's constantly being picked on by his teacher. He's in a group of 4 boys, and they're in kindergarten, they're on the schoolyard, and they're throwing rocks against the fence. Now, should they be throwing rocks against the fence? No. But is that age-appropriate behavior for a kid in kindergarten? Of course. But what happens is he gets singled out for punishment when nothing else happens to the other kids. He's used as the example when all the other kids are out of line, but he's out of line too, and he's the one that's used as an example and pointed to. And so he says to his parents in the morning or his caregivers, I don't want to go to school. Why? Because my stomach hurts. Why does his stomach hurt? Because he's in an environment that is racist, and it's a protective mechanism that his body has in place, but it's also the accumulation of racialized stress. It's the combination of those two things, and it creates a physiological symptom. And lastly, it can also create psychological symptoms. Constant anxiety and worry, increased swearing and complaining, inability to sleep, intrusive thoughts, loss of self-confidence, hypervigilance, frustration, emotional and social withdrawal, anger, anger suppression, and resentment. And so ultimately, when we talk about all these different topics, we don't do so just because it sounds good, but because ultimately, if we don't, then we're allowing our students to be in an environment that is doing harm to them and ultimately to their families and their communities. So that's why I was happy to be able to be here today to help you all on your equity journey and to be part of that process, to learn from one another and to help sharpen our tools so that all of us can become part of that choir. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Wood. I think it's only right at this point that we transition over to our Q&A and really allow some of our ambassadors to kind of begin that conversation. You know, we talk about being asset-based and student-centered, and there's no better way to kind of put that on display than to allow the ambassadors to ask you some questions here. So I guess with that, I'll start off by passing it over to Anthony, and you want to get us started with some questions?
Yeah, good afternoon, Dr. Wood. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Good afternoon.
Cool. Yeah, I also want to say I grew up in a foster home too. So seeing you do this, it pushes me even further. The question I have right now is, since it's a lot of European Americans in the higher education, how do we bring in more Black professors and Latinx professors and Native American professors into college to give us somebody to relate to and learn more from?
Absolutely. That's a great question, and I'm glad to be connected to you, and especially since we have a shared experience. So thank you for that question. I think that there's a lot we have to do in terms of bringing in the right folks to be able to teach our students. And what it really begins with is not just hiring, but hiring for a demonstrated record of success. So oftentimes we don't even ask the right questions. It starts out with the interview itself. I've been to a lot of campuses and they have what's called the diversity question, right? When they're doing an interview of a faculty member, and it goes something like this: can you tell me about your experiences in working with diverse student populations? And that question bothers me immensely. And the reason it does is this, is it tells you about their exposure to diversity, not their commitment. Because anybody can answer that question. They can say that, oh yeah, well, I subbed in a diverse school, or I went to this, a couple of different professional learning sessions on this, or I did this, I did that, right? It tells you about what they were exposed to, but it doesn't tell you what they actually did. And so I think it begins with how we interview our candidates. The first thing I would say is, instead of asking that, I would ask, can you give me 3 different ways in which you've changed your teaching and learning practice to meet the needs of diverse learners, and have them specify what they've actually done. Because if they can't articulate what they've done and what that commitment has actually looked like, then all they're really doing is telling you about their exposure. The other thing that I think that we have to do is that we have to look at their teaching demonstration and take it serious. Like a lot of times a faculty member, when they come, they're going to do a teaching demonstration to show what they're going to be doing in our classrooms, what they're going to be doing to our students, right? And so I think it's important for us to have a rubric that takes into account the things that we know are important. Are they using validating practices? Are they using opportunities to build relationships with students in that teaching demonstration? Are they scaffolding? Are they using culturally relevant teaching, right? So there's so many different things that we should be looking for. And are we looking for the right thing, or are we looking to replicate ourselves? And there's lots of ways that people think about it. Sometimes people talk about it in terms of implicit bias. Some people sometimes they talk about it in terms of social closure. But ultimately what it comes down to is this, is that people pick people who are like them. And ultimately, if you have a committee that is comprised of people who are from one group, they're typically going to pick people who come from that same group. And so ultimately we have to move away from doing that. At my own institution, we put a lot of different things into place that's trying to address this. You know, we have implicit bias training for our hiring committees. that has really good scenarios about what bias can look like at all stages, not just the application stage, but also in the interview stage, in the informal engagement stage. We have inclusion representatives that sit on our search committees, that when people say things like, you know, that candidate, I just don't think they'd be a good fit here, or there's something about them that's just not likable, that someone can be there to say, well, tell me what you mean by fit. Tell me what you mean about likability. And they can push back on those terms that have been used historically to exclude women and people of color. It can go down to the actual way in which the job is advertised, the actual criteria. We changed all of our criteria since I've been CDO at San Diego State. And this is what our criteria are. They now have to show for every single faculty search that they have a demonstrated record of success in teaching and service focused on Black, Latinx, and Native American students. And if they can't do that, then they get rejected from the pool. Now that happens at two different levels. Level one, the department is responsible for doing that. But if you leave the department to do that on their own, not everyone is going to do it. So then after that, it comes to a committee that we staff that has faculty on the committee who review every single one of their finalists, because oftentimes they're going to bring 3 or 4 finalists to campus. And if there's a finalist who doesn't meet that criteria, we reject them. We send them back to the department. We say, you can give us another finalist, but you can't bring us to campus unless you can show how this person has a demonstrated record of success. So we have to start to hire for commitment, not for exposure. We have to actually be truly committed to diversifying our faculty. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have the imbalance that we have, which ultimately creates an environment that's not safe or welcoming for our students. Now, that being said, you'll notice that in that criteria, I said it was about them having a demonstrated record of success. So in that process, we've identified white faculty members who also have a demonstrated record of success. Either way, we're winning, but ultimately this is what it's done, is it's changed the diversity of our hiring pools. Before we started that program, 17% of all of our new hires were underrepresented faculty. Now over 50% of all our new hires are underrepresented faculty. That's what you have to do.
Thank you for that. Gibson?
Yeah, so thank you everyone, and thank you Dr. Wood for enlightening us, giving us more ideas to how to tackle things. So my question is how do we form more genuine and stronger connections between privileged white communities and Black, brown communities among faculty, staff, and students?
So I think in order to create those connections, we have to have it be an expectation. There's a lot of people who can go and work on a campus and navigate their ways around engaging with our students. What we've moved towards is our RTP process, our retention, tenure, and promotion process, where we have a specific statement that they have to do that shows how they've demonstrated and engaged with individuals from different populations and how they've served to mentor and support success for our minoritized students. You have to change the structures themselves in order to be able to do that. That's one piece. Another piece is you have to actually train people in order to be able to do it. Because ultimately, what I find is that you can have, so that sometimes people will have a commitment, but we arm them to do more damage than good. Here's a perfect example of it. Myself and my colleague, Frank, we were at a college that we were doing training on. And my colleague, Frank, he was doing a professional learning session on men, and sometimes talking about how sometimes men are apprehensive to seek out help because they've been socialized to perceive help seeking as a sign of weakness, right? That's an important conversation. I don't think anybody would disagree. It's an important conversation. It doesn't apply to all men, but it certainly does apply to some. And he was talking about what are some strategies that you should do to address that. After the faculty member participated in that session, they left that session and they went into another session that was focused on building relationships with students outside the classroom. We didn't put that one on, but somebody else did. And they told them in that session that if you see a student on campus and they're walking, go engage them, say hi, say hello, right? So there was this white male faculty member who had participated in both of these sessions, got out of them, and he was charged up. He wanted to go and really make a change. So he walks out of the session. He says to himself, you know what? The first Black student I see, I'm going to engage them. I'm going to go talk to them. I'm going to find out how they're doing. So he walks out of the session and he sees a Black male, happens to be a Black male student. He's like, oh, there's one. Walks up to him, says, hi, I'm so-and-so. I teach here. I hear you guys have problems asking for help. So what I'd like to do is to build a relationship with you. So tell me, what sport do you play? So I'll say this, if you didn't hear the series of microaggressions in that, come talk to me later, shoot me an email, we can have a different conversation, right? But for most of you, I think you probably picked up on the series of slights and insults that took place there. And so ultimately you had an individual who had the desire to do the right thing, but had no idea on where to start. And so in that case, it just so happened that the student who he talked to, and actually you're probably wondering, how do I hear about this? How do I know the story? I actually heard it from the student himself, who ended up coming to SDSU later on. But ultimately, that faculty member was humble. And the student said, I am so glad you said that to me and not to somebody else. And the student happened to work on campus. He was a student who had more life experience. He was really patient, and he said, you know what, I can see that you have a good heart, but your intent and your impact are not the same. And so I'd like to work with you. And so every week they met for the student to meet with that faculty member to coach him on how to be better in engaging with students of color. So one, it's a good story about that faculty member's humility. Second, it also talks about the fact that sometimes we're asked to do service, even as students, that we shouldn't be expected to do. That's not part of our responsibility. But ultimately, we have to provide those learning opportunities for people to be able to engage with one another in meaningful and positive ways. Because you can have a good intent and still have a bad impact. We have to separate those two. I would say oftentimes when I do the trainings on implicit bias, I oftentimes say that being biased doesn't make you bad, it makes you human. Because all of us are biased. But if you know that you're biased and choose not to do anything about it, that's what's bad. But for us as educators, if we don't provide those learning opportunities for them to know the difference between intent and impact, what is good practice and what is less ideal, then we haven't provided that framework that's necessary. But that's at the institutional level. At the individual level, as an educator, you have a responsibility, whether the institution provides it or not, to learn, to grow, develop, to be reading, to be watching videos, to do everything you can to improve the work that you do so that you can become even more effective. So those are just two quick things. I honestly could do a whole presentation just talking about what responding to your question, because it's an in-depth question, but I'll leave it right there for now.
Yeah. Oops, Randy, I think there's echo with your sound. Now we can't hear you. That's all right. As you figure that out, Ms. Kay, you want to go ahead?
Am I
Yes.
coming in now?
Oh,
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Yep. You got that, Randy. Go ahead.
Sorry.
We can hear you now, Randy. Go ahead. You're muted.
Everything good now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for that, Dr. Wood. That was a really in-depth explanation. As a Hope Ambassador and an ally, I really do have to ask you, how do allies of Black and Latino male students and other minority populations respond to feedback that the students that they're trying to help are still telling them that they feel socially excluded from their peers and are still actively being marginalized in the classroom and on campus?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think they have to respond with a sense of humility. And I mentioned earlier those kind of public declarations of incompetence, like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to respond. I was never trained to do this. I mean, I think that there has to be humility to learn and to become better. I was actually presenting at a campus yesterday where I had to present some data that was from a listening session with their students. And it was a tough conversation because the students who identify as Black and African American weren't having particularly positive experiences. But at the same time, they had to be able to listen and hear what was taking place in order to be able to improve. That takes humility. And unfortunately, it's a lot of educators, we like to see ourselves as finished products. You know, we have all these degrees behind our names where we show up into the classroom with lots of experience, but ultimately just because we have those things that we're bringing to the table doesn't still mean that we don't have a lot of growth ourselves. And so I think that it all really begins with humility in order to be able to do the work right. I also think that it also is connected to how we think about ourselves and our students in the work that we do. It is very common for educators to bring that deficit mindset into their classrooms, into their offices, into their engagement with students. And those deficit mindsets are devastating because it ultimately does not provide any framework for students to be able to be successful. And so you'll hear a lot of scholars who will talk about the importance of having and conveying high expectations, having a high expectation for what a student can do. And I think that that's absolutely true because from my experience, I've never seen anyone rise to low expectations, right? You have to have that high bar, but ultimately if an educator brings into their engagement with students that they can't, they aren't, they won't, they don't, they'll never be able to see the assets that the students bring. They'll never be able to move forward in their success. I remember at the very beginning of this session, someone talked about the difference between seeing the work that we do as support versus it was a different concept. I mean, it really gets back to that. It's really this notion of how we think about the work that we do. We have what we call in our work the pyramid of success that basically talks about what are the conditions that are needed in order to kind of bridge that divide. At the base of the pyramid are our perceptions, how we see ourselves, how we see the students, and how we see our own roles as educators. The next level up is relationships that are typified by trust, mutual respect, and authentic care. So trust, the student has to know that they can trust the educator. Mutual respect, when we ask students what that means, oftentimes they say that the educator is down to earth, willing to have a conversation, open. And then the last part of that is authentic care. And a lot of times people don't necessarily know what authentic care means. People throw around the word a lot, that phrase, authentic care or care. What we do is we think about it in this way, is it's really a shared or vested interest in students and their success. In the way that it looks like this, where if a student does well, if they hit the mark, if they succeed, if they get the grade they're looking for, if they perform on the assignment in the way that they're hoping to perform, they get the job or the internship, that we are going to personally feel like we did well. But on the flip side, if they stumble, if they fall, if they miss the mark, they don't get the grade or the job or the internship, that we are going to personally feel like we didn't do well because we have a shared or linked vested interest in their success. So it's changing the mindset, which changes the relationships, which changes the practices. And that's ultimately where I think we need to go.
Thank you for that, Dr. Wood.
Good afternoon, guys. Good afternoon, Dr. Wood. Thank you for that answer, because I think mindset is play a big role in everything. So my question is that, right? How can faculty, staff, administration place a stronger emphasis on personal growth, personal development for Black, Brown communities in higher ed? So focus not so much on the math problem or the essay, but why, but the why behind it.
So can you repeat the first part of that question?
So how can we mostly focus on personal growth and personal development? I know you did briefly talk about it in the previous question before, Rondi. Mm-hmm. So I always emphasize personal growth. So can you talk about it more and what that looked like?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the presentation, I talked about that choir, the allies, the resistors, and the defiant. And if you think about those categories and the oblivious, one of the things that I mentioned is that we can be in different spaces when it comes to different communities. So I think personal growth begins with the authentic assessment of where you're at. And that can happen, I think, in a few different ways. The first way is, I bet you if we were all just to have that chart up in front of us, and I was to ask you about different groups, if you're being honest with yourself, you could say, well, when it comes to this group, I'm part of the choir. When it comes to this group, I'm part of the allies. When it comes to this group, maybe I'm more resistant, right? I think if people, oftentimes in my experience, they know deep down where they are, they just choose to ignore it. So I think that it's bringing that to self-awareness. The other thing that can help is that there's lots of different inventories, batteries, tests, surveys, self-assessments that people can do to help understand even further where they're at. One that I always recommend is the implicit association test. I'm sure many of you have taken it. If you haven't, you definitely should. It's offered through Harvard University and in collaboration with a number of other institutions. And essentially what it is an instrument that's used to assess the bias that you have based upon a whole different number of characteristics. It's a short test that you take. I would tell you more about it, but the more I tell you about it, the more you can, more I empower you to be able to navigate around how it assesses your actual bias. So I won't go too deep into it, but I do think that tools like that can be important. I think listening to students can also be important for your personal development and your journey, because a lot of people want to talk about students, but not a lot of people want to listen to them and hear from them. That's why I'm glad that you all are the ones who are leading this Q&A, because you're asking the questions, right? You're driving the conversation, and that's how it always should be. It's always funny when you go to an institution that says they're student-centered and they have a program for a whole day focused on equity, and there's not a single panel where students are talking about their experiences, and you're thinking to yourself, what are you doing? It's like, you missed them, you like totally missed the point. In my experience, I learned more about not only the problem, but actually about the solutions when talking to students. That's why whenever we do focus groups, we always have this question, or even a listening session, we always have this question that we ask students. We say, if you were president for the day, what is it that you would change at the campus? Now, they're not, and the good thing is when you ask that question, they're not restricted by their understanding of the organizational politics, right? They're not restricted by the accreditation requirements or the dynamics between this person, that person. Like, they're not restricted by any of that. They can just say, like, what is it that really needs to be done? And because of that, I find that the best recommendations that we ever get come from students. And in fact, what I love doing is meeting with a group of students, asking them what they want to see, and then bringing those recommendations right to their same administration. Because for some reason, there'll be more, the administration oftentimes will listen to me as an external consultant, right? As an external person, but it's the recommendations that came from their students. And I know those recommendations are going to be better because the students are the ones who are actually experiencing that classroom. They can tell you what the teaching learning looks like. They can tell you the offices that they go to on campus where they're microaggressed. They can tell you what it feels like when a certain policy is put into place that didn't take into account how the students felt about it, or well, how it was going to impact students from minoritized communities. So I think that it's a combination of those things, but it all really centers around, I think, the student voice. That's where the personal development comes. And if we think about those passive resistors that were part of that framework, our job is to encourage them and encourage them to care. And I'll give you, as I close out the response to this, an example of how we came to that. We were at an institution that we had collected data at. It was quantitative data through surveys of students. It was qualitative data through focus groups of students. And we were supposed to do a presentation where we were highlighting this data to faculty and staff. So myself and my colleague, Frank, we show up, we have this PowerPoint based upon all these things that the students had said. Now, there was an accident in the scheduling. There were supposed to be 2 sessions, one with faculty and staff and then one with students. But the student session got scheduled accidentally at the same time with faculty and staff. We got there and it was a room full of both. And the person putting it on was like apologizing. I was like, oh no, this might be even better. So we get to the point where we're presenting some really tough data about experiences. And one of the students, one of the things that we talked about is a pattern that unfortunately we see on a lot of campuses, where the students were talking about in their focus groups how they would see faculty members on campus, and the faculty members would see them and they would put their head down. The faculty member would put their head down, they'd walk the other direction, they would pretend to get on the phone to avoid interacting with the student. And so we presented that. And then there was a faculty member in the room, raised his hand. He's like, I know you all did all these fancy statistics and everything, and I know that you have, some students that you talk to, but I just have a hard time believing that that's what really happens on our campus. I just don't know if I can really believe in that. And I was getting ready to snap back with a response, because I had a response prepared, because I kind of figured that was going to happen. And before I could, a student raised his hand and said, can I respond to that? Happened to be a Black male student. And he said, that experience that you're talking about that you say doesn't happen, that happened to me yesterday. And then he went and he talked about not only what happened, but how it made him feel, and how it made him feel small as a student, insignificant, isolated, and alone. And then another student raised his hand. It's like, well, I want to add on to it. And then another student, and then another student, and then another student. And it was one of the most powerful things that I've ever been part of, seeing a group of people who were entrenched in their beliefs. And I could see them softening as they were listening to the students and recognizing that it wasn't just one student here, one student there, which even then to me it would matter, but that it was a pervasive experience on their campus and there was something that they needed to do about it. So I think when you talk about the personal journey, it's the self-assessments and batteries, it's listening to students, and it's also just being authentic and honest with ourselves about where we're really at in order to be able to change. But before we go on to the next question, I want to know if there's anything that you would add to that. Because again, in the spirit of what I'm talking about, I know that you and the other students here also have insight into the recommendations on what needs to change. And so we'd love to hear if there's anything you want to add, or other students.
No, I think that was spot on and everything. But I don't think faculties or school put emphasis on personal growth or at all. Like, it's just mostly like what you learn in school. So I take pride in like reading outside of school and everything. And like in our community, like we don't really praise that. So every time we talk about it and we talk to our friends about it, it just seemed abnormal. So I had to that was my struggle over time, to sit down and read and be seen walking with a book, because I'll just be looked at like I'm different. You know what I mean? And then so when I try to share my ideas or talk to people, we can't really hold a conversation because there's not a lot to talk about. But thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing too.
All right, I think we have time for one more question before we take a 5-minute break and transition to the audience Q&A. So Anthony, you want to take us home with the final student question?
Yeah, I was gonna say, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, I was gonna say, in regarding to allies, I like to call them progressives. I feel like sometimes allies do more harm than good because they lack the education on how to be a better ally. What can colleges do to better educate the allies or the progressives?
I think it's about having honest conversations with folks, because a lot of people fancy themselves as allies, but are really part of the problem. And it's actually, it was a slide I skipped over on when I was talking about race sliding. And so I'm glad you asked the question, because one of the biggest things that we see that creates a race sliding experience for students is inauthentic allyship. In fact, it's one of our big 4 categories. So what that means is this: we oftentimes find, and I'm going to put it first in the context of faculty of color, and then I'm going to come back to students of color. But we oftentimes find that a faculty of color will come into a new academic department, and they'll have colleagues there who say, I'm here to help you in your career. I'm going to help you be able to be successful in the classroom, to be able to move through the ranks in the organization. I'm going to help advance you in your career. And they'll say that to them privately. All these people saying this to them privately, But then when they look at what they actually do, it's a totally different experience because they're second guessed, they're belittled, they're constantly questioned for what they do. The second part of that is not only that I'm going to help advance you in your career and support you, but I'm going to protect you, right? That let's say that there's a challenge that's going on in an department, there's going to be a meeting, and I know this is going to come up, but don't worry, if your name comes up, someone says to them, don't worry, if your name comes up, I'll make sure that they know that it wasn't you, or I'll make sure to defend you, I'll make sure to back you up. But then when they get into that space, that's not what actually happens, because they're not a true ally. They're an inauthentic ally. They're an ally behind closed doors, but not in public. And you can't be my ally in private. You have to be my ally in public too. Otherwise, you're not truly an ally. And it creates a race sliding experience where then people start to second guess themselves and say, well, maybe it's me. Well, maybe I misunderstood where they were coming from, or maybe I'm just so bad that they can't support me. And you start to second guess your own lived experiences and realities, and even like your confidence in your own being. And we see that all the time with faculty and staff of color. But now translating that back, we also see that with students of color too, right? People, and I hear this all the time from students, a faculty member comes up to them and says, oh yeah, I'm gonna be here to support you. I'm here to help you in any way that I can. But the first time they go to them for support or help, they're like, oh, well, did you look at the syllabus? Or I can't do that for you because I have to treat every single person in my classroom the same, right? And they weren't even necessarily asking for something to be different. They were just asking for insight or support or just a moment of validation, and that's not what they got. And so I think that inauthenticity is incredibly damaging because it leads to race sliding, and then it ultimately leads to that racial battle fatigue. And so I think for the allies to become better, it kind of goes back to almost the question that came before. It's about that personal reflection about where am I really at? And I would say this, the allies, like the folks who are students of color and people of color, they can tell you who is really part of the choir. If you want to know if you're really part of the choir, right? There's a whole bunch of people who can tell you where you're really at because they experience you in your daily life and your daily experience. But ultimately, a lot of people, they don't do that. They are, and I don't like this word because it has so many other connotations, but I'm going to use it here in this way. But people can be performative, right? They can perform support, they can perform protection, but if there's nothing that's actually tangible that comes from that, if they don't actually stand up, then they're not truly an ally. They're really a passive resistor that's cloaked with allyship. Anything that you would want to add to that?
What I was gonna say is I go by what you just said. And I'm also, you probably already said it, but they have to be honest with themselves and be honest with themselves. Don't front for everybody. It's like you said earlier, all people of color or BIPOC community, we can definitely see if you're being genuine or not.
Yeah. Absolutely. Can pick it out very clear. Unfortunately, and the unfortunate reason for that is because we're used to it.
No, well,
I do have another question, E. My bad.
Go ahead.
My bad.
Go in.
Since you're on the West Coast and you guys have like Angela Davis, yourself, over here in the Northeast, we had Cornel West. On the West Coast, what did you guys do to propel a lot of Black intellectuals on the West? What can we do? What can we do in the East to do the same? That makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. You know, there's a lot of people who are doing this work in the East and in the West. I think the challenge is that people have different ways of getting the messages out. You know, we focus more so on so I'm a researcher, right? That's at my core. I might be vice president of student affairs. I might be all these other things. I might have a research. I'm a researcher at heart. That's what I really do. But one of the things that I recognized early on in my career is that I could write a nice peer-reviewed journal article, and I've written many, as y'all, I got over 70 or so at this point, but I can do that, and my 10 best friends are going to be the ones that read it. But I can do a report or brief or a webinar, and thousands of people are going to read it and see it. So part of it is that there is, I think, the intellectual capacity there. I think it's just about what is the mode that you want to be able to make an impact. Now, I'll say this, an institution like my own doesn't necessarily value a research brief. It doesn't value a webinar, but the community that you're trying to reach does. So then you just have to ask yourself, what's more important? And there's times where I've made sacrifices with my own career because of it. I had to choose what was going to be impactful and what was going to be best for my career. And I chose what was impactful. And I think that but when you do that with a sense of genuineness, ultimately word gets out anyways, and you still end up, I think, where you need to be. I would also say that on the East Coast, there's a couple folks or a number of folks, I should say, really, that come to mind that I think are doing good work. One of them is Ebenezer Monty Gallagher. And maybe you all wouldn't consider East Coast, but actually everything for us on that side can be East. There's also Ivory Toldson, who's at Howard University. There's Robert Palmer, who's also at Howard University. So I think that there's particularly some of the HBCUs have also, I think, done a good job with some really high intellectual capacity there as well. In terms of the work that's taking place on Black male students, that it is true that a lot of the centers are in the West. Partly, that's because the environment for creating those centers and the support for it has been a little bit more in this area. But I also want to just dispel something that I think oftentimes is a perception that things are better in the West. The racism is not better in California, right? And the reason for that is this. It's the deep sense of obliviousness. Because when people in California, they think about racism, they think, oh yeah, that takes place in the South. That doesn't happen here. There's this notion that it's an arrogance of immunity, right? That we're immune from the challenges that take place in other areas. And so because of that, you marry that with affluence, you get some of the most damaging people that you will ever meet. And so yes, there may be a lot of scholars who are doing work in some of this area in the West, but that doesn't mean that the environment itself is necessarily a better environment.
No, thank you for that, Dr. Wood. Thank you for that, Anthony. Thank you for that, ambassadors. A lot of really a lot of great questions. I continue to be blown away by what y'all bring to the table. So thank you for that.
Yeah, for the ambassadors, how about that?
Yeah, for sure. Sure. I figure it makes the most sense to just step away for a couple of minutes, just take a little breather. I know sitting down for a real long time can be straining on the eyes and just on, and this is a lot of stuff to digest as well. I figured we could come back maybe around 2:41-ish, I guess, maybe about 3 minutes or so, and open up for some audience Q&A. How's that sound? All right. At this point, I think it'd make the most sense. We had a lot of really great discussion, a lot of really great questions asked, a lot of great information shared amongst all of us. I think it's only right we open it up to the audience and have any questions that you may have answered at this point. And I don't want to put you on Front Street, but I know HP, you messaged me. I'm happy to ask a question on your behalf if you would like, or if you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question yourself, that could happen as well, whichever you prefer. All right, I'll go ahead and ask the question. So the question that was asked was, for you, Dr. Wood, was, this was a person at an institution who recently had a failed search for someone to fill a director position similar to the one that that exists with Hope. Why do you think that it is difficult to fill such positions, and what recommendations would you give to help ensure a successful outcome for such a search?
So one of the well, I do think it's just challenging to fill positions right now anywhere. So a lot of people are making moves. I don't think it's endemic to the position itself. I think it's actually just part of a larger national trend. After COVID-19, I mean, I know we're still in the middle of the pandemic, but it's obviously things that have softened some, and people moved to different places, right? They had a year and a half to really evaluate what was important to them, where they wanted to be. And so a lot of institutions are having problems with hiring right now because people are moving. There's different sectors. Even when you have someone in place and they change, they decide they want to do something else. And it's just because people have had a year and a half to evaluate their lives. I know that it's something that we're facing here as well at my own institution, and every other institution that I've ever had a conversation with is also experiencing that. So I don't think that so personally, I don't think it's necessarily specific to that position. I think it's part of the national trend. Now, that being said, I think there's a lot of things you can do to fill it. Partly, it's really just about getting it out to the right network, and that right network will give you a really good pool. I think, advertising places such as Diverse Issues in Higher Education, or Journal of Blacks in Higher Education, or AHI has some really good outlets that help get information out. Really doing good targeted efforts, looking at people who are in similar roles at other institutions and calling them up, and you really just creating those relationships. I think also, we can't shy away from looking within our institutions too. If we have people who have again, back to a demonstrated record of success, who have a demonstrated record of success of doing similar work, we shouldn't shy away from that. It is challenging sometimes for people to look at people within their own organization and see them as being worthwhile or bringing something to the table. There's a Bible verse that says that a prophet is never welcome in their own land. And it is true that even at my own institution, I can sit in a conversation on college men and masculinities, and my perspective isn't as valued as it is when I go basically anywhere else, right? And so there's something about that proximity to someone that makes us sometimes not value what they bring to the table. And I would say that we can't shy at looking within as an additional strategy. There's also, our listserv. We have the Black Minds Matter listserv that has about 55,000 people or so who are part of it. You could always send it to us, and we'll include it in sending it out to our listserv. So making that available to you. We don't charge anything. We just send it out because we want people to have good people, and there's good people who are connected to that network. And so lots of different ways to be able to do that. But it may mean reconceptualizing how you're approaching the recruitment process itself in order to be as effective as you want to be.
All right.
Other questions, comments, fears, trepidations, areas of disagreement? I want to make sure that folks have that opportunity. I see someone has their hand raised. A few hands.
Sure, great. All right, let's go with my sister first, and then let's go with Marilyn Kuhar.
I appreciate you. I tried to get my video off, but it's not working. But I guess my my question or my thought that comes to mind is like, I know how incredibly important it is to have representation in terms of the makeup of our staff, our faculty at our institutions. And more recently, I just feel like I'm trying to be understanding of the circumstances that have been presented by the pandemic, but I'm also finding that there's a challenge in retaining some of the faculty staff who represent these very populations. So our students who look to these folks to be able to see the possibilities, right, and look to someone to connect with in a different way, perhaps, will get them in, but for whatever reason, we're not necessarily able to retain these folks. And so I guess my question is more around any thoughts you may have around that retention piece, because I thought it was so important what you mentioned about the interview process and some of those questions that are being posed, but equally important, I think, are how we work to retain our faculty, staff, et cetera, in order to best serve our students.
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're right, I talked about the first part, but not the second, in that, and you know, Caroline Turner, she does a lot of work on faculty diversity. And she talks about the faculty diversity is not the hiring process, but what we do before the search, what we do during the search, and then what we do after the search. And so what you're really getting at is that after the search process, some of the during the search things I just put into the chat window for those who want to see just some of the kind of a summary, some of the other things that I said. You know, I think that oftentimes when people leave, it's a function of climate. If you're in an environment that's unhealthy, people will transition to something else when they have the ability to be able to do so. And so I think that we have to think about what are the kind of climate-based interventions that are necessary. One of the things that comes to mind is we just did a cluster hire at SDSU of faculty members who had a demonstrated record of success in serving Black students. And it ended up hiring, well, we were originally going to do 5, and we ended up, I think, doing 12 or 13 that ended up being part of this search. And people might say, well, how did you do that? Well, we basically used replacement positions to do it. And so that was we were able to push it through pretty quickly. But one of the things that we did is as we're hiring the individuals, after we knew that they had basically signed on, we reached out to the academic departments with trainings that we had put together, focus on implicit bias, focus on microaggressions, focus on anti-Black racism, anti-Blackness, and provided that so that we're not just saying come into the environment and we assume that everyone has all the tools they need to make it sure that people are successful, but rather that we assume that they need not just a one-time training, but ongoing training throughout that transitional period and probably throughout that first year that person is here to make sure that it's going to be the kind of environment that they want, that's going to help to retain that person. So that's one thing that I think is absolutely critical. The second thing that we've done that I think is also kind of a climate-based intervention that we did specifically to retain our faculty of color is employee resource groups. So many campuses have employee resource groups. You may have, for example, a Black Faculty and Staff Association or a Latinx Faculty and Staff Association. So what we did, so let me back up and say one thing before I give some of my examples here. At San Diego State University, my president before coming here was a chief diversity officer. So my foundation of what I can do and what we can accomplish at our campus is categorically different than a lot of other places because we have a president who could be, who's a CDO, right? And so it's a little bit different, but we recognize that climate was a big issue. And we had data that we had collected from our faculty and staff and our students that basically said that was an issue, particularly for our Black, Native American, being the 2 most extreme groups, followed by women in STEM, LGBTIQ plus faculty, and then Latinx faculty and staff. So it went in that order in terms of the extremeness of the experiences. And so we created employee resource groups. And what that means was this, is we had, for example, Black Faculty and Staff Association, and it came and it went, and it came and it went, and it came and it went, probably, I don't know, like 5 times. And by the time I got here, it had already fizzled out, and then basically there was no group. And there was only one employee resource group that was really operating on campus, the Latina Network, that was doing mentoring of basically Latina staff mentoring other Latina staff, which was cool. It was great that that was happening, but it was only happening in one area, and we wanted to see greater levels of support. So what we did is we created bylaws, draft bylaws for different employee resource groups. We created a pool of money that we set aside to be able to support them in doing the events that they wanted to do. And then we hired a staff person to support them in the same ways that we support our student organizations. So, and we tried to make it as simple as possible. All you have to do is show up. You just need to tell us where you want to meet, when you want to meet, what you want done, and we'll take care of the rest. The idea was to make it as simple as possible because all of our faculty and staff of color already have extra taxation and burdens that they're doing. So being part of an employee resource group that's meant to create a community within a community to provide a level of support wasn't one that we basically wanted to replicate that with. And then what we did is we said, we'll give you this budget to be able to do the work that you want to do. And all that we ask is that when we bring in new faculty and staff, that you would welcome them. If there's prospective faculty who are interviewing on campus, that you would meet with them and that you would mentor students, the things that we already know that you're going to want to do anyways, but we'll give you resources to do it. Now, today, we have 15 employee resource groups serving over 800 of our faculty and staff, starting from zero 3.5 years ago, or one, I should say, 3.5 years ago. And so I think that that is a kind of intervention that needs to be put into place, because basically what we said is that we're going to invest in our community. And a lot of times we don't do that in the same way for our faculty and staff as we should. And so that's one thing that we're doing that's also helping to retain. The last thing that I would say is that we also had all of the departments put together action plans for climate. So they specifically had to look at their climate data that we helped them collect, analyze their data, have conversations around their data in all 54 of our academic departments. And they had to create a plan for what they were going to do to support a positive climate for minoritized faculty in those departments. And then what we said is that you had to do two things. One, you have to create the plan. And the president before my president said, if you don't have a plan in place by fall of 20, then you can't hire, because we're not going to bring people into an environment that's unhealthy. And then second, now our president has said that if you're not implementing your plan, you can't hire. So it's not only, so it's basically an accountability structure to be doing the things that you need to be doing. Because otherwise, think about what we do to our faculty and staff. We bring a biologist into a biology department where they're going to be the only one by themselves, and we expect that they're going to stay. Why would they stay in an environment that's unhealthy? Why would they stay in an environment that's toxic? But ultimately, now there's a plan that's in place with the accountability structure, with employee resource groups, and ongoing training for faculty and staff and students. And it's that I think is a combination of those things that serves to retain and better retain our minoritized faculty.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the question. Marilyn, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. Dr. Wood, I first of all want to thank you. Thank you. I found your presentation so informative, not only in imparting knowledge, but in being very thought-provoking for me as I'm trying to get better. I'm not sure I'm part of, I like to think I'm part of the choir, but I don't always know what to do. The topic today is the alignment of equity work and putting it into practice. You talked a lot about how faculty and staff can perhaps engage with students. And what I'm asking may not be able to do, it may be a whole separate session, but how do we reach out to others that we see doing things that are inappropriate or not right? Just one or two examples of how to confront, and maybe confront isn't the right word, but to bring someone over to the right side, as it were.
Absolutely. I mean, there's, and you're right. I could easily come back and have a whole session on that, because I think that there's a lot there. So I'll just say two things the first two things that come to mind. One is, well, actually three things. The first would be that we have to respond, and we have a responsibility to respond as part of being equity minded. So if we see someone who is not living up to our institution's values, we have a responsibility to hold them accountable and to say something. Because if we don't say anything, then we're allowing harm to manifest in our environment. That would be the first thing. The second thing that I would say is that we have a framework that we developed, and I'm going to see if I can find a link for it and put it into the chat window, called the Raven Framework, for how to respond to microaggressions when they occur. And ultimately, what the framework suggests is that the first thing we have to do is that we have to redirect, right? We have to basically say, like, you know, what you said, like, I want to stop you right there. I need to, and you want to intercede, right? You have to, the goal is to stop the harm from continuing. And so the first thing you have to do is redirect whatever has been said to our students. Here it is. I just put in the chat window. The second thing that we have to do is ask questions. So for example, I heard you say that students from those communities, that's a bad community. Can you tell me what you mean by bad? And let them articulate it to you. Now, about a certain percentages of people are going to recognize what they said. They're going to know that it was hurtful, and they're going to redirect and pull it back. And that was an opportunity for them to learn. For some people, they're going to dig their heels in, and then you just move forward in the framework. The next step in the framework is values clarification, saying, you know, that in our department, we stand for this, or in our university or in our college, we stand for that. And what you said is in disalignment with those values. But you're clarifying what you're saying, not based upon your opinion, but pointing to values that everyone within that institution has said matters. A lot of the institutions have mission statements that talk about creating an environment for diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, well-being, right? You can point to that. The next step from there is to emphasize thoughts and feelings. You know, when I hear you say students from those bad communities, I want you to know that when I hear that, it hurts, because I know people from that community, and I know how it might make them feel to have heard what you said. Right? So you're emphasizing your thoughts and feelings, you're using I language. And then the next step is to essentially, the in it is to talk about next steps. And if it's a message that is race lighting, for example, and they're being an inauthentic ally, you would talk to them about what it means to be an authentic ally. If they've said something that's harmful to a student, you would talk to them about how they can work to repair that harm and to create reconciliation. But you're talking about next steps. So those would be the things, so some of the things I would say. So it's redirect, ask questions, values clarifications, emphasizing thoughts and feelings, and next steps. So those are the ways that you would engage. But this brings me to my third point, and probably based upon time, maybe the last point, but one I think is worth making. We have to recognize that at the same time, when we're working to improve our organization, that we also have to recognize our organization is not perfect. And so we have to be committed to creating the Underground Railroad. And so what I mean by that is this: when my people, Black people, were enslaved in the South, there was the Underground Railroad, which helped us to escape to the North, where things were better, obviously. But you didn't just stop at any old house along the way, right? Because if you did, you would be returned and maimed and brutalized. And so you had to go to the places and spaces and people who you knew were part of that railroad along the way. So you would get to one location and they would tell you, okay, I'm going to help bring you to the next. And then you get to another location and maybe they couldn't go with you, but they told you just follow the river up to this. And then you're going to see a house that looks like this and stop there, right? And so people don't realize that the Underground Railroad was this network of people all along the way who were helping people and risking their lives, right? To help people get along the way to freedom. And so ultimately, the end goal wasn't the Underground Railroad, it was emancipation. In our light, the end of what we're ultimately shooting for is equity, an organization that is fully and truly and deeply equity-minded from every single fabric of the institution. But until we get to that point, we have to create that railroad. So what that means is this, is you have to have your person in financial aid. You have to have your person in counseling. You have to have your faculty member in math. You have to have your person in career services. You have to have your person in library. You have to have your people who you know that you can send students to, who will love them and care about them and support them in the same way that you will. Because ultimately, if you're meeting with a student and you say, hey, you should go to financial aid and get support. You've made a referral. You think you've done your job. And then they go to financial aid and they get microaggressed, right? Now that reflects upon the advice that you've given. But if you have Susan or Carol in financial aid, and you're like, hey, you got to go see Carol. In fact, I'm not even going to tell you to go see Carol. We're on a Zoom call. Let me see if I can invite her in, or I'm going to make a phone call and connect us, or I'm going to walk you over there, whatever it needs to be. I'm going to basically do that connection so that you can meet with Carol, because I know that Carol will care about you and your success. And then that makes it easier for Carol, that once Carol's meeting with you and she hears that, oh, well, it's not just a financial aid issue, it's an employment issue, and we need to get you over to career service. And there's Jeremy in career service. And so I'm going to connect you to Jeremy, and then Jeremy can connect you to this other person over here so that you can create an environment and a network of support while we're working to create an environment where everyone can be emancipated or everyone can be equity minded. Oftentimes people talk about this in terms of a warm handoff, right? We want to do a warm handoff and do a warm handoff, of course, to the right person. But just remember this, that you can't do a warm handoff to a cold person. So it has to be a person who is part of that railroad. And we need to be building that railroad right now if we want to make sure that all of our students can be successful. The railroad is not the long-term goal, it's the short-term option. But we have to commit to building it. We have to commit to building it now.
That was a bar. Thank you for that. I know we're over time here. I have one anonymous question. I don't know if that's okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. All right. So the question was, let's see here. So in regards to serving in hiring committees, how do you have any suggestions for discussing the need to hire more Black folks? And here's what happened. This person was on a committee and said point blank, we have too many white folks. We need to hire more Black folks. I don't want to add another straight white male to leadership. Maybe I was too blunt, or maybe what I said was inappropriate, but when I said it, there wasn't any agreement from the other Black person serving on the committee. It was super awkward, and I was worried that I may have offended the other Black person in the process. Because the person meant well. So that's the context behind the question.
Okay. So, and the question being, how do you have any suggestions for discussing the need to hire more POCs or Black folks specific to positions? Ooh, yes. Well, one, I mean, you can go to the literature, right? So the research has shown that faculty of color bring something that is categorically different than faculty from other groups. That there's something about our faculty of color that's powerful. And in fact, because you actually prompted my mind, I'm gonna see if I can pull up something. I know that we're at time here, but while I'm looking for this, we've actually collected data ourselves on community colleges across the country, looking at faculty of color and looking at what they're bringing into that classroom. And what we find is that they're more likely to engage in the strategies and practices that we know are important for the success of our minoritized students. They're more likely to engage in relationship building. They're more likely to engage in performance monitoring. They're more likely to engage in conveying high expectations and authentic care, right? So they're more likely to be engaging in these things that we know are important. And I think that it's critical to actually have conversations around those contributions. I found it, so I'm going to share just really quickly here. Here is the data from our own research. This is from our community college instructional development inventory. And basically, this is a survey that we did of over 1,700 faculty from 125 randomly selected community colleges across the country. This is relationship building. The higher the bar, the more likely that they're engaging in it. And everything you see here is a mid to large effect size. So faculty color, more likely to engage in relationship building. Culturally relevant teaching. Collaborative learning. Validating practices, particularly for Latinx faculty. Welcoming environment outside the classroom. I think it goes on and on and on. I think you get the point, right? And so ultimately, it's rooting that in, I think, the research and pointing to that. I would also say that we want to avoid justifying the benefit of faculty of color as being for white students. So I'm going to say something, hopefully it don't make everybody mad, but one of the things that I don't, one of the things that bothers me is when you go to a campus and they talk about, hey, we want to diversify our faculty because it's important for our white students to be in classrooms and learn from Black faculty and staff, Black faculty and Latinx faculty, right? Because it gives them, it's going to better prepare them to engage in a diverse and global marketplace. I think that is the absolute wrong way of thinking about the work, because the benefit of me being here shouldn't be for another group, but for two reasons. One, it supports our students of color, but how about just the fact that I'm a good faculty member and that I bring so much to the table? And so I think it's moving away from that kind of perception that the only interest in us is if there's a convergence of interest for white students. And so I think that that's something also important to keep in mind. There's research that shows that faculty of color are more likely to engage in service as well. Service on campus committees, service in the local community. So there's lots of different reasons that we can point to, but I also think it's okay to just be real that we're committed to diversifying our organization, because if we're not open about the fact that we're committed to that, then we're probably not being as aggressive in addressing the real issues that take place. At my institution, my president came in and said, we're committed to diversifying our faculty. Our new chancellor just came in. We're committed to diversifying our faculty. People don't necessarily like that, right? When they hear that, because what they think is that means it's not them. But ultimately, what we're really trying to do is to prioritize student success. If I hire, for example, a faculty member who has a demonstrated record of success in research, teaching, service, whatever, focused on minoritized students, right? I'm benefiting faculty diversity, but I'm also benefiting the equity gaps that have been pervasive on our campus for years. I'm creating another person who's going to be part of that underground railroad. I'm doing all the things that I should be doing in that way. So I think that it's moving away from those justifications based upon what's good for the general population, and really recognizing the inherent value that faculty of color bring in and of themselves, that's research-based, that's unquestionable based upon the extant research to our students of color, and recognizing that, hey, it's not just about supporting our white students, which is important, but also it's about supporting our students of color and the different ways in which our organization thinks. I'll close with this last statement. There's an article from Caroline Turner, who's probably one of the most renowned faculty members, professors who focuses on faculty of color. And she talks about the benefits in terms of organizational decision-making. And she says, a lot of times people talk about the fact that great minds think alike. And from her perspective, in terms of being an administrator, great minds don't think alike. So you want to improve your organization, you want to bring in diversity. Now, going back to what was said in that meeting, I've said similar things, so I don't feel shy about that, because I say, hey, we want to make sure that we're going to diversify. I don't think that that makes it a bad statement. I think that the response where if someone were to push back on that would only just give me an indication that maybe they're not as committed to the diversification as they say they are. Again, maybe it's an inauthentic allyship.
No, thank you for that. And that's a wonderful way to wrap. Something that's always said during our professional development sessions is a lot is digested, when we're able to kind of collaborate and be in this environment. And hopefully there's something that will be taken away, if not immediately, maybe it's the day after, tomorrow, a month from now, 5 years from now, whatever it is. And just to keep that open learning as an option as you move forward. With that, I want to say thank you to Dr. Wood for taking the time to share your work and your perspectives with us, expand our horizons. Thank you to the ambassadors for asking some really fantastic questions and really moving things forward here. Thank you to Cultural Events and Planning. Thank you to everybody really for just being here, engaging and really trying to move this work forward with everything that is going on. So with that, have a safe and pleasant rest of your afternoon. Really looking forward to collaborating with all of you in the future at other professional development opportunities. And Dr. Wood, I'm definitely going to be hitting you up for that list of information because there's definitely some stuff we could be putting on there for sure.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you all. Have a great one.